there are some things you can say in any public place in America, and anyone there from our town will go, St. Louis, where'd you go to high school? Something like, go crazy, folks, go crazy. Or Johnny Londoff Chevrolet. Or, of course, Ken Wilson's, Oh, Baby! Welcome to Hosted Ravioli, and yes, I am joined today by the longtime voice of the St. Louis Blues, Ken Wilson. Ken, how are you?
I'm doing really well, Benjamin, and I thought you did a pretty good job on that, Oh Baby. You sounded like you were practicing, maybe.
Well, to be fair, I've been practicing since I was 13 years old playing Sega Genesis with Brett Hull and Adam Oates, and whenever I would score, I would do Oh Baby, and now I'm 37 years old, so I've done a few over the years, and I'm sure many St. Louisans have too. And Ken Wilson, of course, you've accomplished so many things as a broadcaster in your career, not just with the St. Louis Blues, but of course here in town, we remember you for that. Right away, where are you living today, and what are some things you're up to?
I'm in beautiful Portland, Oregon, believe it or not, where I've lived for 10 years. And I'm the commissioner of the Great West League, which is a summer collegiate wood bat league. College baseball players play at their schools in the spring, play in our league in the summer, getting ready for pro ball. At least that's their hope. And we have teams in Northern California and Oregon, always looking to expand. And it's a good job for me because originally, in my stay in the Pacific Northwest, I was the head of the West Coast League, which is a more established league in British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. So I've been around college baseball and the business of baseball and having a lot of fun doing it. I've always enjoyed it. And, of course, in the St. Louis area, I started the River City Rascals in the Frontier League, and with my good friend Rich Sauget, we started the Gateway Grizzlies. So the baseball business is in my blood just a bit.
That's awesome, and yeah, I love going down to the park over there in Illinois. It's a beautiful getaway for baseball fans, and of course, sports are so important to us here in St. Louis. And yeah, for every Brett Hull and Ozzie Smith, there's so many, if you will, voices that deliver them to us. And Ken Wilson, you of course did that for many years for the St. Louis Blues, and we'll jump into that here on Hosted Ravioli today. But right away, I was fascinated doing a little research on you. Occasionally we do research here on Hosted Ravioli, and I saw that you were from Detroit and you went to the University of Michigan right around 1968. So I was curious your memories of the St. Louis Cardinals and the Detroit Tigers in the 1968 World Series.
Let's put it this way, Benjamin. The 1968 World Series was probably one of the highlights of my life.
Wow.
Being a great baseball fan. Gave me the first opportunity in my life to go to St. Louis in 1968. You're right, I was at Michigan, and I was the sports director of the student radio station there in the fall of 68, which would have been the start of my senior year at Michigan. And a buddy of mine who was from St. Louis, and his dad was either the GM or the program director at WIL.
Oh yeah.
And he and I were friends. He and I were friends on the student radio station at Michigan, and we were both ardent baseball fans. And we decided we were going to cover the 1968 World Series. And we got press credentials. We somehow found a car and drove from Ann Arbor to St. Louis. And to summarize it, I went to every game of the 68 World Series. When the Tigers won it, which of course was a great happiness to me because I'd been a big Tiger fan since I was 5 or 6 years old, and my family were, they grew up with the Tigers, and I ended up in that dressing room at Old Busch Stadium celebrating with the Tigers. It's hard to imagine in this day and age that a college kid would have a press credential and end up after the 7th game of a World Series in the winning team's dressing room with the champagne flying. But I was there, and of course I was in the press box at Old Busch Stadium with fellows like Kurt Gowdy, who was doing the coverage on NBC, and for somebody who was a senior in college, that was pretty highfalutin stuff. So I have great memories of that '68 World Series and my friend Bob Gibson and how well he pitched, and of course Mickey Lolich, who ironically is a Portland, Oregon native and went to the high school my kids go to now. So '68 was a big year in my life. I was young and trying to do all sorts of things and had hopes of someday becoming a big league baseball broadcaster, and getting to St. Louis at that time and seeing every game of that series was something that clearly I'll never forget.
I'll tell you, you were fortunate. We talk a lot in life about, like, oh, did you get to see someone in their prime? Did you get to see Sinatra with the Rat Pack? Did you get to see the Beatles, if you will? You got to sit and watch in person, not on TV, in person, Bob Gibson pitch in the World Series. What were those memories like?
Well, I had, believe it or not, I had never seen a National League game in person when that World Series rolled around in 1968. And in fact, other than in a World Series, I don't think I had ever seen a National League player or a National League game on TV, because in Detroit, back in those days, they had the Saturday game of the week. And that was about all you saw for baseball nationally. And I think, Dizzy Dean and those folks were on the game of the week. I believe it was on CBS. But in Detroit, they didn't carry the National Major League Game of the Week, which would show you the National Leaguers. The Tigers always played home or away on Saturday afternoon. So I never even got to see the National League on TV. So to see Gibson in person and McCarver and all those Flood and Brock and Maris, all those guys, it was really something. And to be on the field before the games and in the dressing rooms, it was something. I mean, Gibson was obviously unbelievable, and going against, as it was booked at that time, Denny McLain, who had been a 30-game winner in 1968. That was the big matchup. But it turned out that in the lights, it was Gibson against Lolich, the pudgy left-hander. And, of course, Lolich won out in game number 7, and the play and the ball in center field that got by Curt Flood, that was hit by Jim Northrup, was the turning point in maybe one of the greatest World Series ever. And as a Tiger fan, when we were down 3-1, there wasn't much hope going to St. Louis for games 6 and 7, but you can imagine the joy the Tiger fans had, and I had at that time, being a very young fella and seeing those players. But you think back to 1968 and all the great players the Cardinals had. I mean, they had some great players. Ray Washburn was on that club, and Ray and I have gotten to know each other. He used to pitch batting practice for the Seattle Mariners, and he had some big years there with the Cardinals. Ray and I, last September, Ray and I were at the same event at Safeco Field in Seattle. They had the 40th anniversary of the 1977 Seattle Mariners, basically front office people, and Ray was there, and I sat with Ray, and we talked about his days in St. Louis and my days in St. Louis, and of course he lives out here in Seattle. So there were a lot of great players. It was just a fun series to watch. Of course, I grew up as an Al Kaline fan, as folks can imagine, and Kaline was nearing the end of his career, as people will remember, and had been hurt that year, and they just had to find a spot in the lineup for Kaline. How could the Tigers go to the World Series and not have Kaline in the lineup? And that's when manager Mayo Smith made a big decision and took Ray Oyler, the shortstop, who was a great glove man, out of the lineup, and took outfielder Mickey Stanley and put him at shortstop, which opened up a spot in the outfield for Kaline. And if folks look back, Kaline had a very good series with the bat.
Yeah, that is awesome. I'll tell you this. You mentioned Ray Washburn pitched a no-hitter. There's a fun story I heard about famously back-to-back no-hitters. The Cardinals pitcher Bob Gibson. Excuse me, it was Washburn, but it was Gaylord Perry from the Giants, who then no-hit the Cardinals the next day. And the way the story goes is that when the Cardinals were no hit by Gaylord Perry, the aforementioned Tim McCarver was the catcher that day. But then the next day, McCarver got the day off, and the backup catcher was the one who caught the no-hitter. So McCarver, he was part of being no-hit and then had nothing to do with his own pitcher pitching a no-hitter, which I always thought was a funny little tidbit in baseball.
Yeah.
I
Go
ahead, please.
Benjamin, you talk about Ray Washburn, and I'm trying to remember. I can't quite remember what the story is, but if somebody looked up Ray Washburn, you'll see the back-to-back no-hitters. And he also pitched, I believe, in a World Series with Cincinnati. Also, I want to say, and I might not be totally accurate, but it can be looked up. It's something like this. He pitched in the first game at Busch Stadium and the first game at Riverfront Stadium, or something like that. There's 3 or 4 or 5 things like that in Ray Washburn's career that are absolutely amazing, that one pitcher could have had all 4 or 5 of those things happen. I wish I could remember it right now, but it's easy to look up, and it's for baseball junkies, you'd go, no, one guy? No, that didn't happen. But it did with Ray Washburn.
That's awesome. I know, obviously, we'll have a lot of St. Louis fans Googling right now while listening to Hosted Ravioli. But Ken Wilson, of course, you're known for the St. Louis Blues, and I feel like I'm 13 right now talking to Ken Wilson. It's pretty fun for me. Clearly, you are a renowned broadcaster. The catchphrase doesn't define you, and it's good for me. I feel better saying that, because now I'm going to ask you about the catchphrase. How "Oh Baby" took on a life of its own. How did it become, and how is it part of your life?
Well, the good news is that my life goes on without "Oh Baby," because if I'm not in St. Louis, people don't say "Oh Baby," and folks don't know. I was on a treadmill about 2 weeks ago at a gym here in Portland, and a lady comes up who was probably 40 years old, and I didn't realize I had a T-shirt on that had a Blues logo, and this lady comes up and says, "Are you from St. Louis?" I said, "Yeah, I am." And she said, "What did you do there?" I said, "Well, I was a hockey broadcaster, baseball broadcaster." So once in a while I get a connection, but "Oh Baby" started accidentally. Many people I'm sure have heard this story, and at least they'll say I tell the same story every time, that I've never liked the idea of having catchphrases. You know, I don't know why. It's also like I never use nicknames. I've never used a nickname in a broadcast.
Wow.
Never.
Wow.
And I don't know why. It's a personality quirk. And so I was very much against having a catchphrase, didn't try to develop one. For some reason, in the mid-'80s, I said "Oh Baby" somewhere, or a couple of times, and my wife heard it, and she said, "Well, why don't you use that more?" And I said, What are you talking about? I heard you say "Oh Baby." It was kind of interesting. Why don't you use it more? So, that sort of gave me permission to do something that I wouldn't normally do. And I did it, and of course the big fear is you're going to wear it out. You're going to use it too often. So I tried to use it only when I got so excited I could almost not stand it. And there were certainly many times in those 20 seasons with the Blues that I got real excited, and there was good reason to get excited. So that's how it came to be, and fans seemed to like it, enjoyed it, and as you can see, we're talking about it decades later, so I guess people enjoyed it, and that's the main thing, that folks enjoyed the broadcasts.
Do you remember the last time, Ken Wilson, you unleashed an "Oh Baby"?
I think when I broadcast Seattle Mariners baseball in 2011 and 2012, which was exciting to do for me, I used it a little, but the "Oh Baby" is not suited for baseball. Quite like it is for hockey, because you typically don't get as excited very often broadcasting a baseball game as you do a hockey game. But that's probably the last time it was used, and it was somewhat infrequent, and it's not exactly a household phrase in Seattle, Washington.
Now, you mentioned the woman that saw you on the treadmill. She recognized you and just then kind of coyly asked, "Hey, how are you involved with the team?"
Well, she saw the St. Louis identification and just wanted to know if I was from there. She was from Southern Illinois, and her family was big sports fans, and that was it. It's interesting where you run into people. Every once in a while, I'll run into somebody who, believe it or not, will, say, "Aren't you Ken Wilson?" And I admit to it still. So
that's good to hear.
But it doesn't happen too often out here on the West Coast. Some people will. My son is just finishing up his senior year in high school and his 10th year playing ice hockey.
Oh, wow.
And there are a lot of Canadians and real hockey people involved as parents, so some of them are aware that I had a life before my current life, and they'll say something, but
yeah.
I'm pretty well incognito and hidden, and I don't get back to St. Louis too often. I'm trying to think. I've been there 4 times in 14 years, and ironically, I was there twice this past summer.
Oh.
And happened to go to a Gateway Grizzlies game and see my old friend Rich Soje, but unfortunately I was there for a funeral and a visit. My wife grew up there, so she has a lot of friends in St. Louis, and she goes back often, and I do not usually make the trek, but I did a couple of times, and there's still people that see me and go, "Aren't you Ken Wilson, oh baby?"
That's cool.
So, they have long memories.
Yeah. No, I mean that's part of the reason I wanted to do this podcast was just to kind of talk about the things that are entrenched in St. Louis society. Becky, the queen of carpets. You could go up to somebody who's 30 or somebody who's 80 and talk about the queen of carpets. I remember when she flew over the arch or flew through the arch, and same with Oh Baby, and of course the reason it was so popular, in my opinion, was because you embodied the emotion that we were all having watching these games, and we got to watch the great Brett Hull score so many big goals for St. Louis. And for you, can you describe the thrill that was experiencing Brett Hull hockey?
Well, it was great being involved with Brett Hull. I realized a few years ago that I broadcast his very first goal in the NHL when he was a fuzzy-cheeked kid playing with Calgary in the 1986 Stanley Cup Finals. The Rangers, I believe it was I'd have to remember now, but I did his first goal, and I probably did many, many, many of his goals, even though we missed some when he was with Dallas and Detroit. But that was always exciting and typically emotional. And you talk about the emotion. I think some people would say, well, Wilson was making that up. But I love the game of hockey so much and get involved. I played as a kid, and I can feel the emotion, even though I certainly wasn't a good player. I could watching an NHL game. I mean, my body would be on the ice, and I'd know what was going to happen, or I knew what should happen, and I could anticipate what was likely to happen. And I was very emotionally involved, and of course, I wanted the Blues to win every game. So the emotion was real. And Brett Hull provided plenty of moments for that emotion to come through. And, Brett was certainly an interesting character and quite a player. And there were games, where he would, just rise to the occasion at the end. I remember one night at the old auditorium in Buffalo where he didn't play very well. There were nights that Brett just, Brett was just there. And all of a sudden it was like the game was, the Blues were down 2-1, with 1:10 to go or something. And all of a sudden I remember there was a face-off in the circle to the right, and I'm thinking to myself, this guy hasn't done a thing all night. And, he's going to go out there, and maybe it was tied, I don't know. But, they get a face-off, and Brett lets go with that quick snapshot and scores. And, the headline is, Hull's goal gives Blues tie, or Hull's goal gives Blues victory. And that was kind of how it went oftentimes. Yeah. You'd be exclaiming, Brett Hull, oh baby. And that's basically the only thing he did the whole night was score that goal. But that's partly what made him a star. Mm-hmm. He could do whatever you needed to have done at just about any time. And, I think he was a lot better player. Not that being in the Hall of Fame is anything short, but he was a lot better player, all-around player than a lot of people would give him credit for. He wasn't a great skater, but I thought he was a really good passer, and obviously he could shoot the puck. It was always fun watching Brett, to say nothing of a number of other players who were with the Blues in that long period.
You can probably guess the next two calls I'm going to ask you about. One, of course, Doug Wickenheiser. The other, here comes Shovel Day. So we will, let's start with the former. Of course, Doug Wickenheiser scores the Monday Night Miracle in 1986. He is part of St. Louis hockey lore, sports lore, the late Doug Wickenheiser. Can you talk about that moment for you as a broadcaster and for the team?
Well, I have gone back. I mean, you can look that up on the internet and watch that. And finally, in the last couple of years, I think I watched it one time, and my gosh, it was it was exciting. But what really was more exciting than that goal was the comeback.
Yeah.
In the third period, the comeback was absolutely incredible. And when I think of the comeback, I think of Greg Pazlowski. Although, Brian Sutter was involved and a lot of players were involved in that fabulous comeback. Then you get to overtime, and I think people sometimes forget what was at stake. It was Game 6. The Blues were, trying to get to the finals, and in this case, trying to survive and get to Game 7 2 nights later in Calgary. And, so many things had happened that were absolutely incredible, that everybody was on edge and everybody was ready for more excitement, believe it or not. And that it turned out it was kind of a broken play. Bernie Federko was in the middle of it, and there was a rebound or a shot off a leg, and all of a sudden there's Wickenheiser, and so it happened so quickly. Bang! It's in the net, and the old arena was rocking like it never had before. And obviously people still talk about that. That's probably the most famous game in Blues history, and will remain the most famous game in Blues history until they win the Stanley Cup. So
yeah.
it was quite a night, and I haven't forgotten it, certainly. And it's fun to look back, and maybe in 10 more years I'll look back and watch it again. But it brings goosebumps when you watch it.
I can't imagine the bar tabs at Schmeezing's that night over there by the old arena. The other call, Tim Shovelday. It's just a perfect name for a perfect call. I don't know why. It just fits so well. And what I'm referring to is a famed brawl that actually involved goalies, Curtis Joseph versus Detroit's Tim Shovelday, and Ken Wilson had the call. For you, do you remember that moment and the energy from that building?
Yeah, I do remember obviously it was so unusual to have two goalies, in this case Curtis Joseph and Tim Shovelday, and you've got the Blues and the Red Wings, and that always was a lot of hype. So I do remember it, but it was just the fact that the two goalies were involved, and that's why when you hear that, here comes Shovelday, and it was more surprise than anything. It was like, holy cow, what's going on here? And here comes Shovelday. But back in those days, the brawls like that were not unusual. Okay. And they were a big part of the game. I think the game certainly is better today than it was in terms of speed and finesse, but there's a lot to be said for some of the fights and some of the brawls, and Bob Probert and Tony Twist and Kelly Chase and some of the fights that happened, and that was a classic because everybody was paired up, and then all of a sudden you had Shovelday and Joseph in the main event. So who could believe that they would be the headliners in that big fight? It's interesting, Benjamin, how hockey has changed.
Yeah.
I go back to the era when you had to really be tough or you couldn't play. When I grew up, of course, there were only 6 teams, and growing up in Detroit, I was a huge Gordie Howe fan, and when you talk about tough, Gordie was tough. Not only was he the greatest player, but he was probably the toughest player, and you had to be tough to play in a 6-team league, and if you weren't there very long. And I watch hockey today, and it's, again, I think it's for the better, but it's changed so much, just so much. I saw a game in October. I saw Indianapolis play at Wichita in the East Coast Hockey League, and I said to myself, I said, "Gee, does anybody hit anybody? Does anybody check?" The other night I went and saw a Western Hockey League game. I saw the Everett Silvertips play the Portland Winterhawks. They have a lot of talent in the Western Hockey League. I mean, a lot of players go to the NHL. Mm-hmm. And I said the same thing again. They hardly checked. It wasn't rough and tough. And my son, I mentioned, plays high school hockey. After last season, they took out body checking.
Oh, wow.
And, parents aren't supposed to yell and scream. They played a game the other day. He was on a select team, and they went to play in Eugene, Oregon. And my wife went crazy. She grabbed me. I jumped up after about the second time somebody brushed against somebody and got a penalty for checking. I said, "Get out the petticoats!" And the parents looked at me like I was a fool. But I guess that just shows that I go back a long way when, as I say, the game was a real man's game.
Right.
But that's fine. Hockey's terrific. The skill level and the speed is amazing, and it's a terrific game. But it certainly is different from the game we saw years ago.
Sure. I'll put you on the spot if you can remember maybe some favorite places in St. Louis that you used to hang out, maybe get some food or a drink or ice cream or what have you.
Well, I'm gonna be difficult on names. I can go to places. Mm-hmm. Of course, my wife is a big Emo's fan, and when I was there twice this past summer, I had a lot of Emo's pizza. I tend to be a Fortel's pizza man.
Okay.
I got to know the family; they're great people, and I really liked Fortel's pizza all the time, and had some when I was there recently, and it was as good as ever. Also used to hang out down. Oh my gosh, you're really testing my geography. I had a barbecue joint, which there were 2 or 3 of them, and one of them was down, I want to say, at 44 and Woods Mill. Oh. And I wish I could remember the name. I don't know if it's even still there, but I know there were a lot of autographs on the wall, and my autograph was on the wall. When I went back there years later, it was still there. Before the fire, we used to go to Ragazzi's down on the hill a lot. Mm-hmm. And, of course, Charlie Gito's. Charlie is a good friend and knows my brother-in-law very well, and we would go to Gito's a lot. And, of course, talk about St. Louis traditions. I was there 3 days total this past summer, and I was at Ted Drew's 3 times. So what does that tell you?
Perfect. Well said. That sums it all up right there. I know what I wanted to ask you. I should have asked it earlier when we were talking about your college days. I know my wife, Angela, will love to hear about this. You went to college with Gilda Radner, correct?
I did go to college with Gilda Radner.
Well, tell us about college Gilda.
Well, we were not best of friends. I could tell you we were best of friends, and unfortunately she wouldn't be able to tell you that wasn't true, but we were not best of friends. She worked on the student radio station as I did, and I mentioned I was sports director, then I was program director. And, nobody knew what Gilda was going to be in the future, but you could tell she was talented, she was funny, and what I remember 2 things. One, she did voices. That we'd have back in those days on Carson play. And back in those days on radio, if your show started, and I'd have a record show, and, it would be, "Now, ladies and gentlemen," and Gilda did all of those. Oh. And somewhere in the archives, I have a tape where Gilda goes, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, the Ken Wilson Show." And she was always funny. And I do remember one time when Bill Cosby, I hate to bring him up, but he was in town to do a concert. This would have been in '67 or so when he had, I guess, the TV. He was really a young, up-and-coming comic at that time, and he came by the student radio station to promote his concert, and we sat in the studio, and I do recall sitting next to Gilda Radner. There were probably 6 or 7 of us, and Gilda and I were sitting next to each other, and probably 3 or 4 feet away from Bill Cosby, talking to him. So I didn't know her well, but certainly we were acquainted, and she went on to obviously a fabulous career.
Yeah, wow. That's Ken Wilson, Gilda Radner, and Bill Cosby hanging out. What a neat trio from a historic and entertainment standpoint, indeed.
Yeah, I guess I was the weak link in that group, wasn't I?
Well, but you're still Ken Wilson, though. Now,
yep.
My final question is, how can I do this? May I was trying to decide how to ask. May I have an "Oh Baby"? Could you give us one more "Oh Baby"?
Yeah, I can even give you a little play-by-play. As my wife says, you could do this in your sleep. You get. This could be the last one of a lifetime. You never know. Here come the Blues at center ice. Oates has the puck, carries over the blue line to the right wing to Hull. He shoots, he scores. Oh baby, Brett Hull!
I love it. What
there
a treat. Go. What a treat for me, and obviously for the listeners of this podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Ken Wilson joining us on Hosted Ravioli. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Hey, everybody, tell everybody else about Hosted Ravioli. Word is slowly spreading around town. We're on iTunes, Google Play. You can find us, of course, on stltoday.com/podcast. Subscribe. Tell people about us. We want to create an interactive community where people can message me and suggest who should be on the show next. Of course, we're on Twitter at Hosted Ravioli. And I really look forward to hearing from all of our listeners. And Ken Wilson, you're the man. Thanks so much for joining us today. Oh, baby!